In the Alchemi-Culture philosophy, there are 7 polar aspects of humanity that we need to look at if we hope to transform ourselves and the world around us. These are cosmology and philosophy, law and justice, economics and currency, citizenship and social dynamics, agriculture and ecology, science and technology, and healing and medicine. In this podcast, we're going to talk about these topics. We're going to expose ideas that can help inspire an alchemical transformation of our culture, one listener at a time. Hey there, folks. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Alchemi-Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Phoenix Aurelius, and today I have with me Benn Stiofán, who is the head of the Dún Mór Druid Order. And we've been friends for a long time. Ben hit me up a couple of days ago and said, hey, I wanted to talk to you about some ideas that you might have around some Celtic topics and Celtic migration and other different types of things like this. And I figured this would actually be a really fun episode. So this is going to be more of a conversation, far less of an interview, but I'd like to welcome to the show my very dear friend and a great teacher of mine, Benn Stiofán. How are you doing, Ben?
Good, Phoenix. It's good to see you. As I
Man, you
said
too.
before we started, it's been a little bit, but I always enjoy your intensity and your level of knowledge. That's for sure.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's 2 things that I might be known for the most, I suppose. Very intense fella.
That's
So,
great.
yeah, man, tell me a little bit more about what you wanted to talk about via Celtic migration, because in the time that you texted me and told me about this until now, like I've had so many thoughts kind of swarming through, and I figure the best place to start would be wherever you wanted to start the conversation.
Yeah, I'm curious because I have my own kind of ways in which I break down how the Celts came to be as a civilization and as a people and a culture uh and so I'm curious because I don't think we've ever really discussed this in depth before. And so I'd be curious just to hear your thoughts on it and to kind of see where we're coming from on both wavelengths. I feel uh especially now as time has gone on and we've learned more about the broadening horizon of the universe, let's put it that way, that we have different lenses that we can look at the migration through now that we didn't have back then. Um, I I obviously draw on a lot of the story, the traditional stories, because I do feel those are incredibly important. Um, but I also feel like there's a lot of other information that we get now that kind of recontextualizes some of that stuff. So I'm just curious
Totally.
what your thoughts are on it. And I figured we could kind of, you know,
Yeah,
have a meeting of minds on that.
cool. Yeah, this is great. So, when I took Celtic anthropology in university, this would have been circa 2005, somewhere in there, 2004, 2005. I remember that my professors were telling me that the, the entire Celtic regions actually spanned as far east as modern day, like Ukraine and far western Russia, all the way west to Portugal and Spain, of course, and then as far south as about north central Italy, and then as far north as modern day Germany, Austria type of area, and possibly even further. And then, of course, later migrated into the British Isles, and into Ireland.
Right.
And they said that they weren't necessarily shared by a genetic link, but it was more of a shared culture and a shared language or linguistic root that had different types of dialects, and that they were all essentially Celtic peoples and part of um, individual tribes and had very similar culture when we looked at them. The more time goes on, the less I really buy into that entire narrative, one of the things that we're taking a look at that is basing that we're basing, or that scholars were basing a lot of that on, were pieces of archaeology that were very lesser understood and maybe didn't understand trade to the extent that that I think is important, because at different times when we go in archaeologically and we dig something up and we see that there are very similar items, the first conclusion that most people would draw is, oh, these are essentially the same types of people because we're finding similar things. But we know that the Celts, more than just about anybody else besides the Phoenicians, and there may actually be a link between those two civilizations as well,
Right.
engaged in trade through both sea and over land in a way that we could only really think of as modern, like constant trucking of goods, constant movement of goods back and forth. And we do have some archaeological records of things like this, where we see in the Hebrides, North Hebrides of Scotland, we see all sorts of wine that was coming from the Mediterranean, stored in clay vessels and other things. And we can also see that there are brooches of, Celtic manufacture and North Germanic manufacture being in these areas. And I don't think that it's enough sufficient evidence to just take what we referred to in some of the findings, especially along the Seine in Germany, about the Gundestrup cauldron, for instance, or taking a look at Bell Beaker people and saying that this is
Right.
essentially the spread of Celtic culture. I would argue and say that that's the spread of trade, but I also would argue against the concept of Indo-European route, that there is some sort of macro Indo-European route between everything from India all the way into the West, with modern languages of, English and all of the different dialects that you hear in India being parts of Sanskrit and Hebrew, and all of these other languages being connected. And a lot, having been a linguist and studied linguistics and anthropology both in university, and being a scholar of the Indo-European language tree since what would that be, my junior year of high school, and writing long dissertations on it, scholastic dissertations, my main take is that I don't think that there was one root people that eventually broke off and created all of these different dialects. One thing that a lot of the linguistic scholars point to, Ben, is they say, well, take a look at this. The word re, for instance, in Irish, which means
Right.
king
Right. Hmm.
or
Yeah.
leader, and then the word rex in Latin, and the word raj in India,
Hmm.
they all seem to share a linguistic root. And I'm like, maybe the morpheme of an R sound. But what is more likely is the same thing that has happened in modern day based on trade and technology, where the culture that creates the trade piece, the idea or the technology, gives it a particular name, but then in order to speak about it in other languages, it takes on, they adopt it, but they pronounce it with their own pronunciation or whatever. Case in point, in English, where the computer was essentially created and dawned as an article that could be in everybody's homes, um, is computer. And we talk about it as something that's capable of performing large computations, primarily of binary and other sequences that are based on binary, short code, right? And so we call that a computer. Well, then you take that into the Spanish language, and that becomes computadora, basically the same thing, the
Right.
computador. Um, and then you take it into other languages, and a lot of them are going to say the same thing. Like if you go into modern Indian languages, they don't have their own like Punjabi way of saying computer. It just becomes computer, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so the very same thing happens in so many other languages. A few different languages, like French, for instance. So Quebecer French, they might say le computer, but usually you're going to hear it as l'ordinateur, the ordinator, or which is the
Hmm.
same thing. To put in ordinal fashion is to like number or sequence something. And so similar concept, but a different word. And then, in Irish, for instance, the word rivra, we have totally different things. But if we were trying to search for similar morphemes and say that all of these have a similar morpheme, we could pull that out. We could pull the R sound out of ordinateur. We could pull, the ora sound out of computadora, the ER sound in English of computer, and the R sound of rivera, the era in rivera. And we could say, oh, they all share a similar linguistic morpheme, and therefore they must all be related. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. The math there, the logic is just not solid enough. And what seems to me to be true from a genetic perspective is that we have fewer links to one common culture. It's still genetically very difficult for us to point to the fact that at any point in history that all cultures migrated out of Central Europe, which is one of the new emerging theories, or that they came out of Africa, which was what I was taught when I was in university and in school. I just don't think that we have enough data like that. And what seems to be true, Ben, is that when I look at this from a microbiological angle, or any sort of culture, right? But if I'm looking at this level, I have two things that I can do. I can either go macro or I can go micro from this level, and I can see what do I see in either of those levels, because whatever I see there will probably reflect themselves into what we're seeing here. And when I take a look at plant life, or when I take a look at other things, like for instance, in Asia, they have this thing, Polygonatum odoratum, right? Scented Solomon seal. But in Appalachia, we have another one, which is Polygonatum giganteum, giant Solomon seal. They both have very similar properties, but they have different characteristics. And is it correct to say that they originated from the same root species thousands or even millions of years ago and made their way in their transition? Or do they serve similar ecological functions, and therefore they're able to grow according to the ecological functions based on the way more complicated species like bacteria, archaea, fungi developed around them in order to create the conditions that would eventually lead to an evolved plant life? And I think that when it's with human life, it's the same thing. It's like, what types of circumstances existed ecologically in order for people to develop in those areas? I don't think that we just ended up migrating and then becoming so different that the color of our skin changed and all these other features, because we've been around for at least 4,000 or 5,000 years, and the color of skin between Asian folks like in China, Korea, Japan, et cetera, have not changed very significantly. So what is the timeline that we're talking about this? Because then that blows the whole lid on how long human civilization has even been around. If we follow the narrative the way that it's been given to us, it doesn't actually complete enough of the dots to give us a full story. There's always something that says, well, you're saying this and this, but these have cognitive dissonance attached to them. So I am an Indo-European skeptic, having come from a huge background of all of that. And I don't necessarily think that the migrational theories, the way that they've been presented to us, whether that's human beings coming out of Africa, or even the Celtic migrations from east to west, or from west to east, or from south to north, the way that they have been presented by various theorists, I don't know that any of those things can really hold up. Because when we take a look at the holdovers today of modern culture in some of these Celtic areas, modern day Ukraine, for instance, versus modern day Portugal, we're not seeing the same holdovers of a not so terribly ancient past. Like, we're only about 3,000, 4,000 years away from that entire Celtic diaspora happening, and seeing those holdovers. Like, for instance, in Aramaic and Arabic cultures and other things, we're still seeing the same types of similarities. In most African cultures, even tribal cultures, we're seeing similar types of ways of behaving that we can trace back to their roots 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. We're not seeing that across the whole of Europe with these different types of similarities that would be holdovers. And in fact, we start to see entirely different types of civilization popping up. And one could argue maybe because of the Roman influence in most of Europe. That one's a hard one to say, but we do see that also in the Middle East. and their culture stayed intact, right? Like they were all the
Yeah.
way to Jerusalem. So it leads me to have a bunch of different types of questions about this Celtic migration thing. Is the way that it was presented, is there any truth to it at all? Or does it take something else as a method of inquiry in order for us to really determine who were the Celts, where did they originate from, where did they migrate to, and then how do the holdovers of what is currently considered to be Celtic, which is primarily a language-based thing, really manifest, and how can we deduce what is Celtic and what is not from that data that we have, as well as archaeology, of course. We got to take it all into perspective. But
Oh
these
yeah.
other things I think are more important questions. So
Yeah.
Experience the freedom that your feet were designed for with Barefoot brand shoes and boots, the ultimate fusion of protection and primal function. Unlike conventional footwear, barefoot shoes mimic walking barefoot to restore natural biomechanics, strengthen foot muscles, and promote overall body alignment. Why go barefoot? Well, there's a wide toe box, which encourages natural toe splay for better balance, comfort, and foot strength. There's a zero-drop sole, which keeps your body in proper alignment to reduce strain on joints and the spine. And there's also a flexible design which supports natural movement and improves foot mobility and agility. Some of the health benefits include stronger feet and lower leg muscles, better balance, posture, and proprioception, reduced back, hip, and knee pain, lower risk of foot injuries and chronic joint stress, and a heightened sensory feedback for improved movement efficiency. So whether you're an athlete, a wellness seeker, or simply want to move better every day, barefoot shoes are your foundation to better health. Use the link in the description below to stride into better health today while also supporting this podcast. Barefoot shoes. Feel the ground, strengthen your stride, live naturally.
Yeah, no, I think they're all excellent points because we clearly I kind of tend to look at it as the kind of the proto-Celtic theory, which is um the way I tend to sort of break this down in my own head just for ease of communication is I see epochs of time in which cultural influences change either quickly or over a period of time cultural practices. And there are some things that don't fit with those old theories because especially when you consider the time and every generation has its own it has its own blinders on based on
totally, yeah.
what's going on at the time and what are the big um the big concerns that culture is looking at the time. And what you see is the
Totally.
concerns tend to reflect what the theories are about, whether it's the origin of the Celts or the Egyptians or whoever. And what's interesting is that the oldest Celtic inscription we have in a language is in Portugal. It's in the West. So that seems to go contrary to that theory that if it is coming from the East, if this Indo-European language is coming from the East, then why is the oldest Celtic inscription in the West? And I think also when we look at things like Göbekli Tepe and some of the stretches of time that we're being presented with now for the roots of civilization keep going further and further back,
Yeah,
then we're looking at a much more complicated way in which the Celts came about. I mean, to me,
undoubtedly.
it starts with the Paleolithic. And a lot, there is the roots of Celtic culture, I think, go back that far into the Paleolithic. We tend to, like you said, we tend to make these assumptions that race equals culture or genetics equals culture. And that was kind of the older pattern academically that we're still bound to. And
Yeah,
I think that that's not the case. Just like you said, all you have to do is look around in modern culture and see how it changes and how things things get influenced. Now, the speed in which it's done today is probably a lot faster than it was back then.
Undoubtedly, yeah.
But still, there's still I love I can't remember which archaeologist said it, but he was like, most archaeologists, most anthropologists suffer under the idea that seas divide rather than unite. And his is like, no, seas unite, they don't divide. And so we have these ideas of huge separations between people because there's an ocean between them. And yet you see megalithic structures in New England, you see that have very similar aspects to stuff in Portugal, in France, in the British Isles. So there's
Hell, in
clearly,
Indonesia and Korea too, we
yeah,
see megalithic dolmens, almost the exact same construction style too.
absolutely. And so we, I really, I definitely agree. I think there's I look at the Paleolithic people. Just tend to call them the hunters because that's a way in which I can connect with them that isn't so up here. It helps me connect with them more with my heart than my head.
Totally, yeah.
So I call them the hunters. And when you I've had one glimpse possibly of a past life memory at that time. It's very simple. It's nothing complicated. I was sitting, uh, it was in the summer. I believe it was midsummer because the sun was almost directly overhead. I was looking at a pine cone that had bleached in the sun. You know how if they've been sitting
Yeah,
there for a while, they kind of turn that grayish silver color.
absolutely, yeah.
And I was looking at it and just kind of marveling. And I looked in front of me, and there was a creek going through the tundra, and there was a woman lying on her back, um, in like simple clothes made of skin and fur, and just relaxing in the sun, and that's it. But when you connect with the memory in that way, you know that there's a thread running between the current time and that memory.
Yeah.
And and then I and then you have that epic of time, which is immense. People like have no conception of how long that tradition lasted and how powerful it is in it's those experiences make up so much of who we are as people. And it's such a wellspring of strength that we can always draw from in even the roughest amount of times, because we know that we had ancestors who experienced those epochs of time, and all that memory, all that strength is still inside us.
Mhm.
And then I tend to go to you kind of, and I'm breaking this down for simplicity's sake. I am very well aware that it's a lot more complicated than this, but then you get this other cultural flowering of um, who I call the Star Watchers, which are the ones, or the astrologers, uh, the astronomers. You can put it in either way. Some people hate the word astrology. I do not, but
Yeah, sure.
that's a different story altogether. But the um and then there seems to be a seafaring component to them, because all of these megalithic structures seem to be so close to the coast, and there's such a commonality between them. And the fact that the structures not only align with sunrises and sunsets and moonrises and moonsets, but also,
More
which needs to
complicated
be way
constellations.
more. Yeah, yeah, exactly. We need to look at the stars. We need to look at what stars it's looking at, when they're rising. What are the star fields that it's looking at? Um, and why those particular
Yeah,
star fields? Is it only related to, sunrise and sunset? Because they don't all go for just the big bodies.
yeah.
Um, and so there seems to be a navigational aspect to this, which makes so much sense because if you are going to be making your way over vast distances on the open ocean, the stars are your guide. Even the Polynesians, the Polynesians are absolute masters at it.
Yeah.
And then you get what I would say is a turn towards something that is maybe more horse driven. And this is sort of the classic Indo-European thing where it's
Sure, yeah.
more horse driven. There's I think you could look at like Mongolians as a good example of what that culture may have looked like at the time.
Totally.
There's you're following herds, you're herding them yourself. Um, but in the end, like you said, these are all cultural influences. These are all cultural flowerings. And I've never really thought about I haven't thought about the linguistic argument you made as far as the similarities between words, um, because it hasn't been something that I've really looked at, but it's a very interesting thought. It's a very interesting thought.
Yeah, I mean yeah, totally, man. Well, two things. I'll touch really fast on the linguistic component because for me, this is important because this is where linguistic anthropologists are projecting upon not only the language and the development of the language across vast territories and distances, but they're also saying that there's a link to a more ancient root civilization, a proto-Indo-European language, a proto-Indo-European culture. I don't know if I buy that. What I think is more likely is that people just had cultures in different locations, but as a traveler comes in and says, "Hey, all this thing that you're doing over here with this inefficient pottery, that's really stupid. Don't do that. Do it this way instead. Let me show you." Shows them a technology, boom, now we've got bell beaker culture somewhere else, right?
Right.
That seems so much more likely than we developed this culture here and then we were just like, you know what, we didn't outgrow the terrain, we just decided we're just going to move, let's just move west.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Right.
even if it's driven by climate, that doesn't make sense either because climate change would indicate that if this area is inhospitable, people aren't going to stay there. They're all going to
Yeah.
move. And we don't see that. What we see is a general spread. To me, it seems more common sense that ideas that have names, along with technologies that may also have names, ended up spreading and becoming so ubiquitous and a part of the culture that when we look back from an archaeological perspective, we say, well, we find all these things here within this time frame and this time frame. Those time frames can be really huge, by the way. Nobody
Yeah.
ever takes that into full account.
Mm-hmm.
But we take a look at these time frames and we say, oh, look, very, very similar culture. They're using similar technologies. And as far as we know, based on the words that exist today, as far back as we can take them through any sort of inscriptions, written languages, etc., it seems like this would be the thing. Celtic languages are a huge question mark in that regard because there is no alphabet that we know of that existed until roughly the Dark Ages almost. There was no real writing down of information in any of the Celtic languages. Although I find it very interesting that in Greece recently, there was a new alphabet tablet that was found that is far older than the Greek language. And they had just found this somewhat recently. And it does seem like many Celtic peoples would have been introduced to various things, but the types of substrates they would have been doing it on would have probably been organic materials like bark instead of stone. Because Celtic peoples, contrary to like modern belief, Celtic peoples adopted the megalithic structures that were already on those lands. They were far older than most of those Celtic civilizations, than in almost every instance, right? When we see the megalithic cultures, they were there
Yeah.
by
And what influence did the peoples of the megalithic of the people who built the megalithic structures, what influence did they have on the people that were coming uh were new to the landscape at the time, and what
Yeah.
beliefs and what words did they adopt from the culture that was already there? What when for the astronomers, what did they adopt from the hunters? Did they what material culture did they get from the hunters that they may not have had themselves? What words did they get from the hunters that they may not have had themselves? And what spiritual practices, ceremonies, cosmologies, when people, I think we tend to look at it as like one culture dominates the other, and there's certainly precedent for that.
Sure.
But in the end, if you look back, every culture ends up influencing the other one.
Yeah.
It's not a, you know,
Dominance.
big
It's
culture
more of a
here,
share.
small culture here, and this culture just kind of throws away its practices and changes. That never happens. That never happened. It has never happened. So why would it have happened back then?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So for in terms of Celtic migration, the best way that I can foresee this. Now, when I'm talking about Celtic migration, because I don't feel that there were Proto-Indo-Europeans, and I also don't feel that there were Proto-Celtic people. I think that there were Proto-Celtic technologies and
Mm-hmm.
Proto-Celtic ideas that ended up spreading because why? Because they were efficient. They were more efficient than the ideas that had existed in other areas. And so I think the idea spreads. And of course, with ideas, certain amounts of people are going to spread. But when we're talking about merchant class individuals, sailors, over the road, truckers, for lack of a better term, they are the ones that are moving, and they're the ones sharing and spreading and saying, hey, back in my hometown, we've got an idea, and we call this idea, this word.
Yeah.
That word, that idea might spread, and it might actually take on some sort of new dialectal difference and be able to be manifested. But I don't think that we were actually sharing similar culture, similar diet, similar other things from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. I just don't think that that's the case.
And then when you bring in the stories from Ireland, and you see the complexity that they create, it's not a simple story. It's just not a simple story. So,
Oh,
we have the story of Kesser being the
yes.
first woman who sets foot on Ireland, but that there are some and this could be an amalgamation, or it could be different traditions from different parts of Ireland. But there's also the unfortunately lost book of Drumshnachta, which says that the first woman on Ireland was Banava. And Banava being one of the three words for Ireland, and
Yeah.
one of the three
Greek goddesses,
beings,
therefore, too.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, that Aurelian meets when he comes to Ireland, and after he goes out over 9 waves and he comes back, and you get this triplicity of women. So you get Banava, Fola, Eru,
Eru. Yeah.
and the and to me that is that in some ways is now you can break it down into culture, but you can also break it down in an otherworldly sense and a spiritual sense. So you have, if we wanted to talk about it on a terrestrial level, these three mothers could be representations of the people who were there first, the ones who
Totally.
moved into Ireland as pretty much as soon as the ice receded, they were there. And you can also look at it as the consciousness of Ireland itself, the land itself, that is expressing in these three particular ways that the peoples are interacting with, and knowing that the land is conscious, it has agency, and it has memory that can be tapped into in order to better the lives of the people, which is the roots of Druidry right there. We know, like, we can go all the way back to that point. It's not a, it's Druidry, I think, in its essence is a very simple thing. It's a go-between between this, your people, and the other world and the land, and how all three of those things in the end up becoming one living being, and they inform each other. So, and in the story of Kieser, uh, this obviously gets tied into the biblical Noah story, because they are refugees from who also kind of built their own ark and sailed off in a different way, and didn't stick around with Noah. Now it's possible that you know, it's complicated because we make assumptions. I think that, oh well, these were just Christians trying to kind of graft Irish Christians trying to graft their culture onto the Hebrews and sort of make a story. Well, how do we know that's the case?
Yeah.
Is it possible that there was a common story that was in Ireland before Christianity came, and when the two met, people went, "Oh, that's weird. These stories are so similar. Perhaps they were related." Or does it harken back to things along the lines of an Atlantean uh culture that could have that have a similar root in an event that was so massive that the memory of it has endured, but changed depending on the perspective and depending on the people who are telling it.
Hey, there's some really interesting shit right there, actually. Let me dive into some of that, actually. I've
Mhm.
got a few ideas. I don't have opinions yet. All I have are
Mhm.
ideas. So I may have talked to you about this guy before. Have you ever heard of a guy named Crichton Miller who wrote a book called The Golden Thread of Time?
I haven't. No,
Okay. Really interesting. I suggest picking up his book. He also has a bunch of papers published on academia.edu. His whole thing was that he was a ship's captain, technically a yacht captain for most of his professional career. And he was doing some investigative journalism kind of stuff with one of his friends in Egypt. And they had found some documents that had showed that up in the Queen's chamber in the Great Pyramid, Khufu's pyramid, there's this huge shaft. And there are a couple of these relics that were found that dropped to the bottom of one of these deep shafts out of the Queen's chamber. There's like this large vertical shaft that goes down.
yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I've seen some specs or plans of that. I've never been to the pyramids myself, but
Yeah,
yeah.
neither have I, but I've studied this pretty in depth because of this topic in particular. So what they find is basically a piece of wood, maybe about, let's say a yard long or something. Okay. And then they find another one that's about almost 3 yards long. And then they find this interesting brass piece that basically is kind of shaped like this, kind of like the Aries sigil is
Oh
shaped.
yeah.
And then they find this ball. And this ball is, I forget what it's made out of. It could be clay, it could be brass, not really certain. But anyway, they have that. And so, what was interesting was that years before, in trying to do some calculations and just doing some amateur Neolithic style astronomy, Crichton Miller goes out and he grabs a stick and he tries to like use it as a sighting stick to determine where a star is so that he can sight it in. And this is going to help him to make measurements. But he finds holding it like this, he's moving around all over the place and it's not really stable. So what does he do? Well, he takes that stick and he puts another stick perpendicular to it so that it's essentially creating a cross. And then he kneels down and tilts the large stick back towards him and then uses the horizontal stick as his sight stick. Now all of a sudden he can see it, but he doesn't know what the trajectory is. So what he does is he goes to the store and he buys some freaking protractors and he tapes them
Oh
out
yeah.
along the edges between each of those 90-degree angles. And then he stands back and he says, well, this is interesting. I just created a Celtic cross. This is really weird. But then he ties a plumb line attached to a weight down at the bottom so that there's a string so that when he tilts it like this and he can look at that star, now whoever is standing here can take a look at where that plumb line crosses at these different intersections. And now
Interesting.
you can tell that there are angles. And if you can tell that there are angles, you can not only navigate the stars and determine precession and movement and angle there, but now you can do this as a surveying tool on the ground as well. And he says that he thinks that this Celtic cross is a far ancient technology that was the only thing that's necessary to be able to navigate over open waters, to be able to build megalithic structures, at least to do the surveying of it and the
Yeah.
understanding the angles and geometry of it, and to be able to calculate distance between stars and motion, movement, trajectory, etc. And he shows how to be able to do this in a three-dimensional axis with his book so that you can measure up and down, you can measure left and right, you can measure forward, backward, just with this one tool. And so he patents this thing and hoping that the patent office is going to say, well, yeah, it turns out that there's one of these in the past, and so it checks out. Well, they didn't, but they said, no, all of your math checks out, and the use of this checks out, and they grant him a United Kingdom patent for this. He's a Scottish guy, right?
Wow.
And so he patents this, which is essentially a very strong claim because you can't just get a patent on anything. The patent scientists have to check things out in order to make sure that all of the literature, all of the sources, all of the uses, all of everything completely check out. They check out. And so he says, well, there you have it, folks. Either I'm a genius who just came up with a super primitive tool that could have been used to figure all of these things out, or it's more likely that this thing that we found in the pyramid is just their same version of this, and that it's called a rod of power in ancient, and we know about this. The priest class always had what was called a rod of power, but we don't know what that looked like. We don't have extant drawings of it. But the fact that it's stored in Khufu's pyramid, high up in this weird shaft area, up above the king or the queen's chamber, definitely seems to indicate that there's something special about this. And he asserts and he shows in his book how with nothing other than that tool, you would be able to navigate by midnight position of stars, and you'd be able to tell where all planets are at, where all constellations are at, what time of day it is, and what the sun is doing as a result of that, because the sun is going to be exactly opposite at midnight, wherever the midnight sky is and whatever constellation is directly above head. You'd be able to know that the sun is directly opposite that at all times. And he goes to show that you would be able to navigate over vast swaths of ocean by being able to calculate both latitude and longitude with this thing. And he asserts, because we find all of these old shipwrecks that are way older than the narrative of these, because when we talk about seafaring navigation, you've heard this, people sailed in these leather and canvas boats, basically currachs, right?
Right.
They're all over the world. They've sailed in these currachs really close to shore. Bullshit. Do you know what happens when a boat gets close to shore? It grounds out, it breaks. They're not going to do trade that way, man. They're just nobody's going to do trade that way. That is a really silly way to do it. The best thing that you could do is during high tide, get out of the dock or the area that you're at and get into open ocean so that even as tide is low, you're not going to risk bottoming out your boat and sinking yourself.
Right.
You're not going.
Yeah, the classic Viking ship that, has got a nice shallow draft so they can go far inland,
Yeah.
And when some of the underwater archaeology they've done near oh man, I'm totally spacing the name of it. The area of land between that is now submerged between
Like Doggerland?
Denmark and Britain.
Yeah, Doggerland is what they.
Doggerland. That's right. Yeah, yeah. And how they found shipbuilding structures there that were clearly for making ships, and they're like, "Whoa, this is way earlier than we thought that ship technology existed." So again, you get this, you keep getting these pushbacks in time of culture, and we just it just seems like and this is with a whole bunch of different things, but especially with the study of ancient times, we keep laboring under these assumptions because, the idea of standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, at some point you have to go, well, maybe we can reassess the entire narrative again, which I think really needs to happen
Me
because
too. Yeah.
not that what people did isn't, like, I am not one of those people who's like, oh, throw out everything they've done. No, no, no. It's just a question of reassessing what they did learn and integrating that into a broader perspective so that we can see it in a different way. And so we have a more flexible view of what occurred.
Yeah.
And,
What
you
was
know,
even possible?
yeah,
We
totally,
have we have to
totally.
open that up, because my problem with history at the present moment is that the facts aren't able to speak for themselves, but people are trying to extrapolate data and put it together in a way where, if we were to convert the data that we have to a mathematical sequence, the sequence would be illogical in a way that does not add up.
Hmm.
And if we can just allow data to speak for itself, then we can have ideas instead of a narrative. I think that that's where we've gone wrong with a lot of our historical textbooks and education, is that this is the narrative and this is how it fits into, this method for Rockefeller education purposes. I would say that no, it really doesn't. And the more that we find, the more that we're realizing, nah, there's some really weird shit, like 250 million year old footsteps down here in southern Utah.
Right.
That it's like, okay, that blows the lid on the entire human narrative of migrating out of Africa.
And
They
what do? We throw those things out. They're inconvenient to
are,
the
yeah,
to the broader story that's already been written. So we look at it and go, oh, well, that's just something weird. And it's just like,
yeah,
well,
that's
wait,
an
whoa.
anomaly.
Like,
Let's not
like,
pay attention to
wait,
that.
stop. Like, we can't just say that that's an anomaly. Time out,
Yeah,
this means something. And let's instead of shutting discussion down, let's open it up. Let's make it, let's give it some interest and some life again. I mean, it just astounds me that so much of academia is built around this idea of, like, well, eventually we're going to come down to this one story that's going to be totally bulletproof, and we'll put all the data into perspective, and there won't be any further questions. Like, no, that ain't ever going to happen.
I
Okay,
know.
let's look at the universe as it is, and realize what an amazingly complex, and I would argue alterable reality than we think it is.
Yay, there you go. Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
as fixed as it's been presented, I think. So okay, so let's go back to this with this cross. Let's just
Mhm.
pretend, because this is the best that any of us can do, is utilize data points that we have and say, well, how could this happen? One of my
Mhm.
ideas is that during the stargazing period, our star watchers,
Mhm.
moving out of just pure hunters, or, we don't know what the fuck. Okay, if we go to we go to
Exactly.
Sumerian work, and if there's any basis whatsoever to any of these Sumerian myths and legends, then there's some weird star people coming around. A lot of
Yeah.
Native American tribes say that same thing. A lot of
Mhm.
Mesoamerican. I mean, a lot of Dogon culture, a lot of African thing. They're like, hey, star people came and did this thing, and whatever, and then left us behind. Okay, so maybe there is that, and maybe there was really never a strong hunter period in the way that we think about it, besides, like,
Mhm.
oh, we're just trying to pick up the pieces. Is like when the Roman Empire left Britain, they're like, what do we do? I don't know. Nobody knows, you know. Same thing, what happens when the gods leave, when these alien species leave, and we're just like, what do we do? Hey, I know that son of a bitch tastes really good and it's going to sustain me. Let's hunt that thing for a little while. There may have been interim, or there may have been just only certain cultures that got left in the dust like that. Other ones,
Right.
who knows? Maybe some
Yeah.
of them were like my same mindset, and they're like, hey, I see weird shit or weird writing on the wall. I'm bugging out to the middle of nowhere, and I can hunt bear if that's what I need to do.
Yeah, exactly.
That's like that's kind of what my life is about right now. Is like, I found a spot
Hmm.
in West Virginia. Ain't nobody ever going to find me, and I got bear out there if I need them. So, so yeah. At any rate, that's the idea, is that maybe one of the technologies that was left around was geometry, which is also astronomy, you
Yeah.
know, and land surveying, right? Which also means ocean surveying. And let's just pretend that some of these cultures spread out and actually tried to move all over the world. I don't know what their impetus is, but let's say that they move all over the world and that they build monuments that are essentially timekeeping pieces, calendars, if you want to refer to them like that, that
Yeah.
and there is some evidence about that in terms of, like, if we go to Korea, we see the same types, almost the exact same types of megalithic dolmens that we see scattered throughout Europe, especially in the British Isles. Why would we see those in Korea?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
What is the result? Why
Absolutely.
are they dating to about the same time period, give or take 500 to 1,000 years?
Hmm.
That's weird. So maybe they're trying to, create a grid here on the planet and say, hey, if you see this, then you know that you're within this latitude. Maybe you know you're within this longitude. Maybe you know you're within this Earth energy, that, every so often there's a different one that kind of spells out a different energetic. I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know what they're doing.
Yeah.
But what I think I do know, as far as I can tell, is that as it pertains to Celtic cultures as they exist today and Celtic languages as they exist today, those are so far away, anthropologically, archaeologically, from the Neolithic, that whatever was built during the Neolithic is unlikely to have had any direct contact with those cultures that are now called Celtic. They were already there by the time they existed with Celtic language.
Right. Right.
And
And what extent is it possible that their language may have influenced the birth of that, uh, of, what we now call Celtic culture or Celtic language, whether it's Irish or Scottish or, because all of those have morphed also, since, like you look at some of the really early inscriptions on Ogham, they look so much like Gaulish. It's just incredible.
yeah,
And so you're seeing further down the roots of the language. But, and to your point, we throw out a lot of the indigenous knowledge. We throw out a lot of the old stories and we
all
say,
of it.
well, those were just, sort of convenient explanations.
Myths.
Like, no, 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 no. These are stories that have been birthed far closer to the event than I have by looking back and armchairing it through books or through research papers or
Totally.
whatever it happens to be. And so when you have the Tuatha coming from the north of Ireland, not from the east, not from the south, but you have the Firwalach coming from the south.
You know?
So there's all these there's a complexity that the old stories have that the academic narrative just lacks. And it doesn't take into account especially when you look at the old stories and the influence of the spiritual dimension and the she and how they guided and directed, I would say, the development of the culture that we have now. And we tend to look at things as on a materialistic level solely, especially when we get into these narratives. And that's just the way of academia. That's a cultural affect that we suffer from, which is, you know, left over from the beginnings of science when the church and scientists sort of made a, an unspoken agreement. Look, you can talk about the material world, but if you talk about the spiritual world, we'll burn you at the stake. And that cultural affect has, lingered since then, and it's really hobbled both branches of human inquiry in a big way. And so when we talk about the origins of the Celts, we really do have to look at further than just the migrations, because or what the common story of the migrations are, is because, like you said, we're looking at a number of different origins from different places based on the landscape and the needs of the landscape, and then the transmission of ideas that may have nothing to do with the conquering of one larger culture over another.
Yeah. Well, and I really don't have much reason to doubt the written records, even though they were transcribed by monks. I have really no reason to doubt that information as being at least a clue in the right direction, even if it was painted within the concept of, Noah and this whole thing.
Right.
Because isn't it true that in the genealogies of the Firbolg and the Tuatha that we see from Starn McNevu on upwards a similar, I think it was Srang speaking with Yochi, if I remember right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's clearly grafting that goes on in the older um in the
Yochi
older
Press.
ancestral trees. But that doesn't change the fact that it's possible that multiple narratives happen to just mesh up. And so they made the leap on their own to say, oh, well, maybe this person was, related to this person.
Here's the way
And
that it actually seems to me, Ben, about all of this
mhm,
is, if any of that information is true, which is a big if, but
yeah,
if any of that information is true, Starin McNevu would have been essentially what we would refer to as like an Hispaniola Gaul, an Iberian Celt.
right.
That Iberian Celt, they said, traveled north and reached Ireland. There was a plague. Well, actually, no, that's not true. The plague happened to the group that happened before the Firbolg.
Yeah, you have the Parhalon, the people of Parhalon, and all of that, stuff. And then that often gets dismissed too as like, well, it's just a story they put in there, which to me just doesn't make any sense. You don't just inject a story into a culture and have them buy it. That doesn't work. If it's not already there, people are going to be like, "What? What's this all about?" I don't know what this is about. And they say, "Well, Parhalon is related to the word Bartholomew." And it's like, well, maybe, but that
Maybe.
seems like kind of a reach to me. I've never really quite understood that connection linguistically. And there again, you have these sort of assumptions made linguistically that tend to just sort of throw out the anomaly, throw out the
Yeah,
anomaly, throw out the
exactly.
anomaly. And so you have Parhalon, and then there's the plague. Tuan Macaral is the only one that survives it. He shapeshifts into the form of a stag, and then he sees the coming of, you know, uh, the Nemedians, or
Yes.
and so, and all of everything that takes place with them. And the Nemedians, uh, or
They get dispersed.
the
Yeah,
Neve, are the ones who are the root people in the stories of both the Firwalach and the Tuatha, because when they meet later, after they've left Ireland, after there's the big war with the Favoira, they come back and they recognize they're speaking the same language.
exactly. Yeah. My flesh is gladdened essentially at the language that you speak, I think was the way that
Yes,
that
yeah.
translates.
Yep,
So
totally.
What is really fascinating to me about all of that, though, is that we have this Celtiberian past in
Mhm.
Ireland, and we can actually show that there is a group in Spain that has a similar genetic phenotype as also a people in modern day Turkey and Syria that are sharing huge percentage of genetics of people who are modern day Irish individuals. We're seeing very similar genotypes inside of these individuals. To me, that indicates that there is some actual claim to that. And you know what? Here's what I'm going to say. Where did they get
Mhm.
the ability to sail? Seems to me like that's Phoenician thing, where they were at in the Celtiberian Peninsula, just near the Pillars of Hercules, really. That indicates that the Phoenicians had already been there for a long time. And we find archaeological records of trade that had been done by the Phoenicians of things that were Egyptian and Middle Eastern that are making their way to Spain. And we can find those things archaeologically still today. So it seems to me that there's a holdover of Phoenician culture
Mhm.
that has existed all throughout the Mediterranean, and that certain technologies that we deem to be Celtic may have actually been spread at an earlier time by these Phoenician people or Proto-Phoenician people who were seafaring navigators who traveled out and started populating an area. And I think that most, and now here's where it gets tricky though. Okay, if we're talking about an actual people, an actual race, and then we go back to uh Laura Nagevla, the Book of Invasions, and we say, okay, but what happened to these people? They got driven underground by the time the Milesians come, which are also a Celtiberian people.
Right. Right.
So, but what we're again seeing is, and there have been speculation, I think you and I talked about this, are we talking about the end of Stone Age and the beginning of Bronze Age technology? Or are we talking about when we're talking about the Parhalonians and then the Nemedians, is that the difference between hunter and skywatcher, or the difference between, hunter-gatherer and more Neolithic technology, the way that we would
Yeah.
think about it? And is the difference between Nemedians and then their kind of progeny that happen at a later point down the line in their history, talking about the Firbolg and the Tua,
Mhm.
where they end is at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age? Are these reckonings of ages that are happening? Are they astronomical motifs that we're talking about different types of precession? Are we going back, here we are moving out of the age of Pisces and into the age of Aquarius within the next 100 or 200 years or whatever.
Yeah.
Back before that, again, you would have before the age of Pisces, the age of Aries, and before that, the age of Taurus, before that, the age of Gemini, all the way back. So are we continuing to see that these are the reckonings of the stories that were available still at that point in Ireland of these different age switches? Are they technological age switches? Are they whatever? And if so, if the she went underground, one of two things must be true.
Mhm.
Either there is some sort of weird multidimensional component to DNA where living people today would still show these Celtiberian roots from Phoenician culture, which we're seeing, or that we're seeing that the Milesians are actually the first human type of individuals to live there, which does not meet the archaeological record.
Yeah.
But if the she went underground and people are still sharing that DNA with the she,
Mhm.
that seems weird to me. But it also actually, from my own personal my own personal spiritual practices, seems to make sense, because it's really hard to say at a certain point, once we go back genealogically, what was she blood, what belonged to the Tua, what belonged to the Firbolg and the holdovers of those peoples, if that story is true, versus what became the lesion. Because the histories in the Book of Invasions tells us that the Sidhe, they went underground and under the lakes and water sources and other things. I don't know how to explain all of this. I don't know
Yeah,
how to
there's a
explain it at
there's a
all.
dimensionality, dimensional shift aspect to it that really fascinates me. And one of my teachers, Orion Foxwood, in one of his conversations with the she, one of the things they told him was, as you are now, so we once were. As we are now, so you shall be.
Fucking A,
And
that's what the Mormons say, you know that. That's what the Mormons say about God. That's hilarious.
yeah. And so there's a sense of, I think that there's a, when, and this gets into the whole, this gets into the woo-woo aspect, which I love. And we get into what are the layers of evolution that a being can go through. And then and how does a civilization, how does it, how does it, um, how does it move through different levels of reality or different vibratory rates as time goes forward? And we don't know how long that timeline is. We don't we because of the shape-shifting nature of the planet, what is still here from long ago and what is not. And this of course gets into the the morphological nature of reality, that it can change. It isn't, it is not as static as we all would like to think that it is. And I think the way we've been taught that it is, because you get things like the Mandela effect, or you get things like these archaeological anomalies that seem to have no place in what the common story is of how things have happened and the timeline in which they've happened. And when it comes to megalithic structures, we don't know. There's no real way to be certain of what their ages actually are. We can make guesses. We can say, well, there was a piece of rotting wood that was found under this base stone, and carbon dating puts it to this date. Well, that's still an assumption that the stone has never been moved, the structure has never been rebuilt, the structure has never been repaired. There are all sorts of things that we make assumptions to, that may not, that simple explanations can upend.
Yeah.
And we, again, when we throw out anomalies, we really rob ourselves of the ability to expand the horizons of who we are and where we came from.
Yeah. And to understand that the way that history played out is probably infinitely more complex than what an archaeological record or carbon dating is going to give us complete proof of.
Yeah,
Truth is
absolutely.
stranger than fiction, more
Yeah.
often.
Oh, yeah. Thank goodness, right? That's the way it should be.
Totally. So, yeah, so with that being said, yeah, it's very, very fascinating to me. And to be perfectly honest, I think that the Celts, if I were to really talk about who are the Celts and what does migration theory look like based on the data that's available, I think that there were Celtic technologies that spread all throughout Europe because they were more effective than maybe the other technologies that have been used. And I think that there are similar phrases to discuss ideas and to discuss those technologies and behaviors, all of those different types of things that were somewhat common between most European peoples. However, when I take a look at what is definitively Celtic and what has holdovers throughout the last several centuries, we can see that cattle raiding and cattle herding has been pivotal to every single actual Celtic culture, whether we're talking about those in Brittany and Breton, whether we're talking
Yeah.
about those in Cornwall, those in Wales, the native Britons, the Picts, the even Northern Germanic tribes, before we start classifying them as Norse people, I think that they were probably also more of a Celtic. I mean, the Gundestrup cauldron, all those things come from those areas.
Yeah, I mean, the further you go back, it's hard to tell. I mean, even the Romans had a hard time telling, well, who are the Germans and who are the Celts? Like they seem to transpose those tribes all the time because we look at it that way because we have the filter of nationhood now that didn't exist back then. We're putting nationhood onto a chieftainship structure that doesn't, and they don't fit.
They don't fit at all, in fact. So yeah, that's but we're seeing very, very similar types of things. And we're also seeing the gene of those who can drink milk, but who cannot very easily process iron from red meat or from most meat sources. And if you take a look, there's an archaeogastronomy, which is taking shards of pottery and food substance things and recreating the diet based on the bits of archaeology that we have. So we call that archaeogastronomy.
No,
And
yeah.
one of Ireland's greatest living archaeoastronomers was recently interviewed. This was just a few years ago. And he said, what were people eating several thousand years ago in Ireland? He said, well, we're always finding little shards. Like there's this 33,000-year-old shard of the femur of a red deer, which is essentially an elk, that has what looks to be a tool marking in it. And so we think that there were hunter-gatherers here 33,000 years ago, and that pushes the timeline in Ireland way back. That bone could have been found and worked at any point in the future. So I don't necessarily buy into that either. Did that deer exist 33,000 years ago? Yeah, but man, just take a look at bogs and how well preserved things can be that are stored in bogs, and how much bog and moorland is in Ireland. That could have been tooled at any later point and pulled out of a bog, and there's a lot of weird things like that I have to say probably not a thing. But we see the same types of genes existing amongst Scandinavian populations and Northern Germanic areas. We're talking now Northern Germany and Denmark, as well as all of Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland even. And then we see Northern Ireland, Northern Scotland especially, having a huge culture around bull keeping and around herding. And this is a holdover well into the Dark Ages, where Ireland's wealth was still measured in the amount of head of cattle that people, and they were not feasting on that meat too frequently. In all of the stories that we have into the Dark Ages, that's when meat feasting started to become popular. So this archaeogastronomist was actually saying they were eating what they called white meat, which is not your chicken and fish that we call white, but rather something much more similar to what is culturally called skyr or skur, depending on your Norse country. It's kind of like thick probiotic cheese, almost sold like a yogurt. It was also going to be things like curds and whey, and what we think of as an Indian technology called paneer. They're going to be like compressed milk type of things, and these were what they were eating because the gene for hemochromatosis is so common amongst those individuals that if they eat red meat very frequently, they hold on to the iron and then end up having iron overload and iron poisoning.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Super common. If you take a look at hemochromatosis and study the genetic link between that, it's almost exclusively Nordic countries that still have this. Nordic countries and Ireland. And that's it.
Wow, that's wild. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the old laws in the Brehon laws about, which milkings would go to which person. The first milking goes to the druid, the second milking goes to the master of the house, the third milking goes to the rest of the family, or the first milking goes to the guest, those sorts of things. And what depending on what class you were in, what you could put in your oatmeal. But they're all eating oatmeal.
Yeah.
It's just a question of what they're putting in it. Are you putting in cream? Are you putting in butter? Are you putting in honey? Are you putting in salt? Are you putting in the third milking? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, that whole white meat, the dairy aspect of it, as really important. And I remember, in fact, I had this is a long time ago, but I had an herbalist at one point uh, take me completely off dairy, and it was awful. It was awful. I suffered immensely, and I just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And she was like, "You know what? You need to go back on dairy like right now." And it was kind of one of those fads back then. This was like, I think this was back in the the early 90s, I guess, would have been when that whole thing occurred. But I find that fascinating. There's a whole it's amazing how much knowledge there is out there to get, and especially when it comes to like even just the food practices and the culture that grows up around that is pretty incredible as well. Like um and the plant communities. That was one other thing I wanted to mention before I forget. When they studied the difference between plant communities in Great Britain and Ireland, what they found was that the plant communities have more in common with Spain in Ireland than they do with plant communities in the British
Right.
Isles. Of
Which
course, that's altered because there's been so much there's been
totally.
so much contact between the two since then. But originally, what they found was that, and so the idea, the notion at the time, and I don't know what the most recent research is on this, but that there was a that when the sea level was a lot lower, there was a land connection between Spain and Ireland. And I find that fascinating that continues, as time goes forward. There's a connection between those two countries that seems to go way, way back.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And Portugal too, Portugal
Mhm.
too. Still, I think you can fly to Lisbon as a connecting flight from the United States and get your flights oftentimes cheaper than if you just fly direct from New York to Dublin or
Oh,
whatever.
geez, that's a good tip. We
Yeah.
we actually we actually finally got direct service from Denver to Ireland, which I'm just like,
No, Aer Lingus. Aer
yeah,
Lingus.
man. Yeah, it's so great. I can't wait to use that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to wait until next year, but yeah, I'm
Well, me
psyched.
too. I had to cancel my trip to Ireland here this year because we'll be moving during that time. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, so for me, Celtic elements are really part of the culture. We're talking about parts of music. We're talking about parts of language. We're talking about parts of similarities in behavior and in gastronomy. And that's what, to me, really culture is. And when we take a look at all of those things, I can really only say what we have as definitive Celtic culture today, with the exception of probably northern Italy, a decent part of central to northern Spain, and most of what we'd consider to be modern day Portugal. Those were probably the Celtic territories, to be perfectly honest with you. And actually, we can include parts of Denmark and other things like that. One of the things
Mhm.
that I always go back to as well is what the hell did they mean when the Tua separated from the rest of the Nemedians and they went to the quote unquote four shining islands in the north? Now, I've actually done a lot of intrinsic data field investigation about this, and it seems like what they were doing was actually visiting the places where there were native peoples that we would refer to today as Sami, and that they were visiting places like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, or better yet, maybe even Norway, Sweden, Finland,
Mhm.
and learning the styles of magic, understanding the landscape, understanding so many things about culture. When you go back historically with the Sami and listen to their legends, sounds like the two probably were learning something from these far ancient people, these Sami people. And when you take a look at what are the four closest islands to the north from Scotland, or from Ireland, first of all, anything directly north, there wasn't really anything there. But if we use the map that we have today and assume that it was somewhat similar to the map that they were seeing, because there still could have been weird islands that are now submerged that were parts, you know, holdouts of Doggerland or whatever else. But if we take a look at it, it would be Scotland or some of the Outer Hebrides, hard to tell, but those are still Scottish today, so we'll call them Scotland.
Yeah.
There's Sweden, Norway, Denmark. Those would have been the 4 places that were northerly, at any rate, to Ireland. I don't know what they were finding there, but the Picts probably would have been in Scotland at that time. And they had some interesting things going on. How far back they extended, we don't know. I mean, the Picts are still very mysterious to us. But the Sami people, according to their own legends, they've been in those northern territories for a long time. They used to take over the entire territories as migrational lands up until the Germanic tribes started migrating north into there. And this is where we get Norse culture. You know, what we think of today as Norse culture is those Germanic tribes migrating up into these areas and then living near the lower latitudes and pushing the Sami up into the higher latitudes.
Yeah, and the uniqueness of Norse culture, you know, being a blend between a Germanic culture and a Sami culture, and you know that's what fascinates me is when 2 cultures meet, how a third thing is born. There's a third aspect to it that is that tends to endure, and so both of those cultures survive. It's in a different form, but it you know it the it's you know the daughter or the son of 2 parents.
Totally. So yeah, I find that interesting. I also find the shipbuilding, you know, because the Tua arrive not just in a curragh. That's not what they arrived in. They arrived in basically a ship. You know, they were some sort of strong seafaring people. And what's interesting about Sami people even today is that they look quite Asian. And you could say, well, they just migrated across, you know, from Mongolia and through the northern areas and they stayed. No, that's not their own legends. They were seafaring for a long period of time. And so are the types of Asians that we see in Mongolia, the types of Asians that we see in China, the types of Asians that we see in Korea, how similar actually genetically are those things? I've always thought the same thing since I was little. I was like, Native Americans and Mexicans, Mesoamericans, they have to be Asian to some degree. Like when you take a look at skin color and take a look at eyes and other things like this, they look so Mongolian to me. And even the sounds of their languages, even though they're different, they're quite different, but they bear more similarity to them than they do, say, to a Greek language or than they do to, say, you know, what we would now conceive to be any European language.
Yeah. Well,
and
you
had the opportunity to work with Native Americans and study Native American archaeology, right? Wasn't that one of your degrees?
Yeah, that was, you know, originally it was Southwest archaeology, you know, when I was in school in college. And one of the things that was one of the places where I really did start to understand how removed academia was from the native stories, because you know, we go in and we look at a place and we go, oh, this means this and this means that. And then you ask a Hopi about it and they're like, no, that's not what that means. You know, and it's just like, no, that's actually this and actually that, but it gets but again, a lot of that gets thrown out because well, you know, they're just looking at it through this oral tradition, which isn't, you know, as accurate. And it's like, wait, what? No, that's
their tradition. Who are we to say what's accurate?
Yeah, exactly. And the Hopi, but they have they go through a series of worlds, into the uh, the fourth world, before the fifth world, and in the beginning of this world, and you know their stories say that there was a great flood, a great inundation, and that they made their way across the ocean, going from island to island, and that they landed somewhere in modern day Chile, on the western side of the continent, and then and that when they arrived, their their the guardian of this world, and I can't remember how to pronounce his name, so I'm not going to try. He tells them that the reason that the successive worlds are destroyed is because um the people stop they lose their gratitude.
Hmm.
They lose their gratitude for the gifts of creation, basically the gifts of food, the gifts of shelter, the gifts of good weather, the gifts of uh, a clean water, good air, and a beautiful world. They lose their gratitude, and so things get corrupted, and the creator comes, and there's a great cleansing. And so um, the he tells the Hopi that you must, before you settle down, you have to go to all four. And I believe this comes from I think this is a Spanish word, pasos, um, of before you will find where you're supposed to settle down. And so they have to go all the way to Tierra del Fuego. They have to migrate all the way up to the Arctic Circle. They have to go all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and they have to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and then the guardian of this world will tell them where they're supposed to settle. And again, we look at those things as sort of quaint little stories that are held over from you know held over from oral tradition, but there's a lot more to them, and you can verify a lot of that stuff archaeologically. But we equate material culture with race or with genetics, and like you said, that's most likely not the case, and we really need to get that. We need to separate those two, because I agree with you. It doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah. Well, shit, man. The more that I even study genetics, the more tricky that whole thing actually becomes. It gets presented like it's a science, especially when we're talking about, oh, you have genes for this type of pathology, this type of disease. Breast cancer runs in your family.
Mhm.
Hmm. The more that I look into that, the less that I see that that is actually true. We can have genes that present themselves in a normal, healthy way unless they undergo some sort of trigger event. Once they undergo a trigger event, which could be driven by a lot of things, it could be driven by a change in climate, by a change in location, by a change in diet, by a change in emotions, by a
Mhm.
change in other what is called the virome. The way that I look at the virome, which is basically that there are tons of bits of DNA of everything, and we're constantly interacting with it and kind of swimming in DNA soup. And how did those things alter our own DNA? That's kind of what they refer to as the virome.
Interesting.
I
Yeah.
look at that as our spiritual connection to one another, is that the DNA of the trees, as the tree puts out dead cells and they blow in the wind and I breathe in that wind, that tree cell and its decomposing proteins and other data that come with it, including the microbes and other things that may be colonizing on it, they become part of me. They enter into my body, they become part of me. And as I breathe, my DNA stays in with part of every breath, and that gets shared in, and everybody's breathing in everybody else and everything else. And like when we drink, when we eat, when it's all from the same thing, we're all sharing the same genetic information, we're all adapting together actually.
Beautiful. Yeah,
So
beautiful. Yeah.
for
It's the
me, that
sharing of information, the sharing of essence. Yeah.
exactly, and how we are all truly one and all connected. That method of connection is not just some sort of weird metaphysical thing to me. It's an actual thing. And I think that if we wanted to, we would be able to develop technologies that would help us to accurately measure those things. We just haven't looked in that direction far enough. But what's true about the human capacity is anything we put our minds to, we're capable of doing. So if we wanted to, I think we could do all of that. But, we're learning about epigenetics, that epigenetics change everything. And this depends on who we're exposed to. If we move to an area where, our peoples have been surrounded with bison and buffalo, let's say, for thousands of years, and then all of a sudden now we're forced to live without those bison and buffalo, our virome has to change. Our entire DNA changes. And what we look at is that certain genes that ate those meats and that engaged in the hunt and that experienced the sacrifice and that experienced the intensity and the love for those animals and for making the pemmican and other things that store them through all those traditions, all of those emotions, all of those physical conditions have now changed. That's going to alter the gene sequence pretty significantly, because now we're talking about just on a physical level of eating. Now all of these other proteins that we're used to in these very, very particular combinations and ways that have sustained us for thousands of years, let's say, no longer there. So the genes, in order to keep a population alive, they can't just say, hey, we don't have the building blocks, we're just going to die now. What they do instead is they say, you know what? The genes have this thing where it's called a mutation or a polymorphism, where it says, hey, if ingredient A isn't available, use ingredient B. But what that does is it creates a whole new set of encoding. So instead of encoding a new protein or encoding an enzyme the way that it is ideally suited to, if it has building block A available, now it has to build new enzymes or new proteins or new whatever is what those genes do with building block B. And they can do it, but it alters the expression. And now sometimes we say, that's a pathogenic expression. I don't buy it. I think it's the expression that is necessary when what we're used to does not exist anymore. And it's an adaptation gene that is going to create some sort of weird symptoms for sure, but I don't think that it's a permanent pathogenesis. And the same thing too, like when we take a look at Irish genes from the time, especially from Cromwell onwards, but when we take a look at it, even from the Tudor dynasty onwards, when, we get subjugation and the clearances, and now we'll rent your land back to you. We'll let you live and work this land if you pay us rent. Oh, if there's ever such a bastard move in history, that's totally, like the one. But once we do that, we also see at that same time period, Tudor dynasty, the introduction of the potato to Ireland. And the potato actually this is something that I think is really important. The potato is a symbol of downtrodden and people and a repression in Ireland and in Scotland. They were given the potato and forced to eat the potato, and while all of the rest of their ancestral foods were removed and exported.
Yeah.
And the emotions that come up with being downtrodden and having literally thrown into a survival state, from being the country that was the most responsible and the most intellectual for over 700 years in all of Europe during the Dark Ages. If it wasn't for Ireland, there are many books that even contest this, the Western world's knowledge would have been forgotten.
Yeah.
All of the learning was preserved in Ireland, and the writings were preserved in Ireland when the rest of Europe couldn't really give a shit.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden that gets disregarded. The Irish people dehumanized, their language taken away, their religion taken away, all of these things, and now their diet taken away and forced upon them the potato. And now you take a look at what has happened since then, and the diet has stayed the same, even though the governmental circumstances have been able to change. And unfortunately, the government that they set up bears more similarity to the government that oppressed them than the government that they had that was really far ahead of its time, even far ahead of its time in the modern era.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Especially the creation of laws. Yeah. 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 And I think that when you look at it from a genetic point of view, I think there's also a spiritual continuum or an energetic continuum that is behind the material part of it. Because like if we go back to, as we were talking about earlier, with Parhalon and there's a plague and everybody's wiped out except for Tuan McCarroll, and he shapeshifts into a stag. And then he um, tells the Nemedians the memory of the land when they arrive. So he's able to convey to them to the history. And so what I think the beauty of that story is that there is something that and this is a strength that we can draw from when there is a wholesale traumatization of a particular culture, that there is an underlying spiritual thread that connects us all the way back. And so when Tuan McCarroll shapeshifts, what I think when I see shapeshifting in a story, what to me that's like that's well, it can mean a couple of different things, but one of the things that it can mean is that you're seeing the experience of a being from one incarnation to the next, and that there's a memory that's held there and a spiritual energetic lineage that it carries, that it's able to express every single incarnation, because we have the memory of this life, but then when this form dies and we return, we have access to the memory that spans lifetimes,
Mhm.
and we have a broader perspective. And so I can, you get, I can see, especially in shamanic practices where, or, practices of like voodoo, where a spirit comes in and possesses the person and speaks through that person the knowledge that is needed for the culture at the time. That's kind of the role of the go-between, or that's the role of the druid, is to tap into that underlying spiritual river that is not limited to the material circumstance. And yet, like you said, there's also the physical component of it that we're all swimming in, which I love. I'd never thought of it that way. I think that's brilliant. That that there's all this information that's also encoded into this, these molecules, the everything that I'm made of right now goes all the way back to the beginning of creation, and it has its own memory that I get to join with when I'm born.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. There's definitely, and I think really, we're probably looking, if we take a look at these things, the spiritual and the physical, if we wanted to like create a vast dichotomy
Hmm.
there, I think what we're actually looking at is probably all the same material. There's just a material way of looking at it, which is particle, and then there's like energetic or wavelength, whether we're talking
Yeah.
about electromagnetic waves or whether we're talking about causal like scalar waves, right? I think that we're really probably talking about the exact same things with spiritual and physical, and that it's all reality is multidimensional simultaneously.
Yeah, totally. There's
And
it's like there may be a density change, there may be a vibratory change, but in
yes,
the end it's all one thing. It's all one stuff.
yeah,
Um, to
exactly.
use a technical term.
And so, it's like when we breathe in this genetic data, when we're swimming in this soup, what memories, what ideas, what thoughts, what emotions, what etc. are also being implanted simultaneously. Because I think that all of it's got to be multidimensional in that way. I don't know how else it could really work. But I think that you're right, is that with Celtic cultures, this goes back again to what is Celtic and what is Celtic migration. I think we can really only call Celtic cultures people that had druids, You know, I think that
Yeah.
that's one of the important factors, because unless you had Druid, which is interesting, very interesting. Did you
Mhm.
know that there's a people that bear immense similarity to Druid people in Lebanon? They call themselves Drush, Drus.
Oh yeah, 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 yep. Yeah, I know about the Druze. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, so
totally.
they are, their modern expression is significantly different than what we would
Hmm.
expect from Druids in Celtic. But if you listen to their
Yeah.
stories and their history and what the Druids were capable of, we're like, wow, there's a lot of similar threads there. So, it's very interesting. And we see other interesting things like that in India, where we see very lighter skinned, more Caucasian like individuals that have their entire culture set up in India. And some of their cultures, they say, like, oh, yeah, this was during the time of Alexander the Great when they came and marched through this area, and some of them ended up staying or whatever else. So we do get transplants all over the world, either due to military campaigns or marketing campaigns, or and when I say a marketing campaign, I don't mean they were advertising with fucking Meta. What I mean was that
Yeah.
they're like shipping goods across continents and oceans and whatever else. That's a marketing campaign in the past, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Well, and that leads into another discussion we should have at some point, which is the difference between an Irish druidry, a druidry of the Rocky Mountains, a druidry of the Canadian
yeah, New
tundra, a
whatever.
druidry of the, take your, how druidry changes based on the landscape and the times, and the similarities we'll have, and then the differences we'll have, and how important and how meaningful those are too.
I think that that's a really important and actually very timely conversation to have at some point,
Mhm.
because you have your Irish Irish magical tradition Nazis in the world
Mhm.
today, Laura O'Brien, and and then which I was talking about this with Sean Padraig O'Donoghue as well
Mhm.
recently. It was like, it sucks that anything that is not part of this very scholastic tradition is all of a sudden not called Irish anymore. The way that I learn, and same thing, you and I have had talks about this too, with
Mhm.
what is Druid? What is it to be a Druid in the modern age? What is it to have Druid principles? All of these things are really, really timely and important questions, I think. Very specific conversations, but I think very important. And I think we should definitely bring in uh, Sean Podrick and get some of his persuasion on this. A dialogue between the three of us
Yeah,
could be
that'd be very interesting.
really
Yeah,
fun.
I'd be all for it. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's important is that we have there's a um we have a responsibility to the roots of Irish Druidry in particular, and the people who have created it, who helped form it as it is. And I'm not talking just that stops with the Iron Age. It doesn't stop with the Iron Age. It goes all the way through modern times, and everybody in that lineage gets a say over what it is now. And you get a lot of poo-pooing of people like Yeats or AE, or, oh, that's all Celtic Twilight fluff. It's like, no, 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 no. You need to study what they did during their lifetime, and the the dedication they had to the survival of Irish culture and the language. And I can't hold a candle to those men. I can't.
Well, could you imagine being put in a situation where the dehumanization of Irish everything is what's
Mhm.
present? There's only song and legend and story that is even remotely valued as a source of entertainment, and having the job, the sole impulse to try and preserve what you can of the culture in that time period with that
Oh
narrative.
yeah,
And that's
totally.
the way that I look at Yates, right? That's
Yeah.
the way that I look at all of, Lady Gregory, Lady Grey,
Yeah.
or whatever. Same exact type of thing, though, is that, they had an immense an immensely different world upon them than what we do now. And so it's really easy for us to say, well, they were only doing this and this. It was just reduced essentially to wit and to storytelling and whatever. No, that's the preservation that they were capable of within their era. And we do have to take that into deep consideration and
Oh,
see
totally.
how the adaptation and how the evolution of the stories, of the traditions, end up changing, because it's all equally as valid. We can't just go back, like you were saying, to a single point and say Irish culture stopped somewhere in the middle of the, early Iron Age. To
Mm-hmm.
do that is a really silly thing, and I think we become very fallible, and Druidry would become so much less if it wasn't adapting to the needs of the individuals at the present time, and it would
Yeah.
just be a museum piece. I talk about Chinese medicine, I talk about Ayurveda being museum medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they have not adapted to the toxicities of the modern world, and the theories, evolutions, and items of pharmacopoeia have not expanded with the amount of globally available medicines and how to categorize these things. So both the pathology and the medicine that are being used to address things are still stuck very much so in the past.
Yeah.
And Spagyria was too, actually. It's just that
Hmm.
I'm taking it upon myself to kind of take it out of the 1530s and out of the 19th century occult revival and to throw it into our modern age. But yeah, we
Yeah.
need to take a look at Druidry. And even as much as I kind of get a little cringed just because I don't like this style of 19th century occult revival Druidry,
Yeah. Yeah.
but that's just my own thing. I mean, we
Mm-hmm.
don't like the way that our parents do shit either.
Yeah.
And, it's easy to criticize the generation above us and say, oh, they just blah, 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 blah. But that's what I'm doing with my own magical tradition. I was born out of that 19th century
Right.
Bible
Right.
tradition. And
And that's
I
something I really learned from my time in the Southwest and interacting with Native people is that the the respect they have for their elders is so powerful and is so much of so much of an indelible part of their culture. And what we don't realize is that as if I get up and let's say that I happen to disagree with something that Yeats wrote, or I disagree with something that some of the revival druids wrote. That's fine. That doesn't mean that we always have to agree with each other, but we need to extend the respect, because without that respect, what we don't realize is that we tear down our own ancestry, and we sever the link with our ancestors. Because if I spend my life trying to overturn what has been said before and I disrespect it, then I set up the pattern for the same thing to happen to me, to the people that will come behind me.
yeah,
And one day, what I write, what I teach, everything that I consider sacred, I set the precedent for that to be overturned
and
after
to
I'm
be
dead
vilified.
100 years
Yeah.
from now, and to be vilified. Yeah, and that's not the way. That's not the way. That's not the way in which a tradition continues to draw sustenance from its roots like a tree does.
Hey, I think that's important. Well, we're at the 2 hour mark here
Yeah.
conversation, which is
Yeah.
amazing. And I don't know that we're necessarily any closer into discovering what our total viewpoints are on Celtic migration and other things. We did cover so much of this, but I think there's just data points and there's a lot of questions, and it, I think we can get closer to what may have happened the further away we get from the official narratives that
Hmm.
we're given, and
I
just
agree.
taking as much data in as we can and holding just great ideas that are open and malleable and willing to change in the face of new data.
Yeah.
But if we develop narratives or belief systems about the way that it worked, or we become too rigid, then it takes away from the totality of the experience. And one of the things that I'm reflecting on right now is that folks like yourself and myself, we definitely, there's a part of us that it was born out of academia and born out of scholasticism. So we bow with humility to the archaeologists and anthropologists and other
Mhm.
individuals that are doing the work that they're doing. And at the same time,
Yeah.
that's not the word of God. There is
Yeah, totally.
there's so much
Yeah.
more that needs to be taken into account and taken into experience, and the legends, the tradition, the oral histories, the all of these different types of things, the mythos, as they were transcribed by the Christian monks, and all of the other,
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
order
let's be grateful for the amount of hours it took to dig those sites and the planning and the 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 dedication that a lot of archaeologists, really give to their craft and how much they put into it and what it means to them. And that I'm not out to discount their perspectives. I just think that what we need is a is an isn't a isn't a throwing out of everything. It's just a recontextualizing of things and a commitment to be okay with the story changing, and that
yeah,
we can and that we shouldn't be throwing out the anomalies that we are, and admitting that the complexity of it uh is an important aspect of the whole endeavor.
yeah, it is. Well, and if anything, that alone, if we take on that perspective, for me, that adds a compassionate stance to anybody and everybody throughout the ages that has waded through the mire of this in order to
Yeah.
add some element to a tradition that we have access to today. And it also gives me a sense of responsibility to sort through and wade through my own mire of things enough to be able to help to pass that on and to preserve it enough for the next generation in a way that will be culturally and sociologically important and relevant to them. So yeah,
Definitely. Definitely.
here we are, Celts in America.
Yeah. All right. Well, it was really good talking to you. Good seeing you again, Phoenix. Yeah, let me know when we're getting to if you want to do that other conversation, because I'm curious about that. I'd be interested to hear everybody's thoughts.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that it would just be a really good thing, especially if we come at it from the angle which I think is most important at this time, from a voice of Americans, or as childrens of the
Mhm.
diaspora, however you want to pronounce it.
Yeah.
Um, because my experience is that we are so Irish in who we are, in the ways that our family raised us. We have more similarities than differences, actually, even with people living back on in the motherland right now. But we get disregarded as being Irish because we're definitively also American. And our perspectives on spirituality, our perspectives on language, and our perspectives on a lot of things actually have shifted enough that we are our own thing. This exists in Australia as well and other places where there were
Mhm.
huge Irish populations. But here we are as individuals who feel the calling of our ancestors, who are definitively Irish and born out of this tradition. But here we are growing up in a culture that is no longer necessarily just Irish. How do we reconcile that, and
Yeah.
how do we feel okay with that, and do we call it something new? Is it a new evolution altogether, or is it something that needs more representation and inclusion? um, there's a
Yeah,
lot
and
of
I'd like to see more dialogue, because I think it would be really cool for there to be I think, and this is my commitment for Dune More as well, which is I don't want to I don't want to create a a dogmatic structure that says we believe X, Y, and Z. And if you don't believe X, Y, and Z, you're not welcome here.
yeah,
What I want is what I want is a druidry that is okay with people disagreeing with each other. What I want is a druidry that is okay with people seeing things in a different way, and that we're not out to create a story that we all subscribe to. We're out to explore. and to always explore, and to admit to each other and to ourselves that the exploration never ends, that we have the gift of having an unknown country in front of us that we can all experience and learn from together. And if we can, and that means I want to know what the experience of Irish culture is from the indigenous Irish point of view. I want to know what a druidry is based on someone who's lived like myself in Colorado my whole life, and the experiences I've had that have shaped the cosmology that I have. I want to know what it's like to be a druid who lives in like Meg in Alaska, and what her experiences have been, and why she's come to the conclusion that she's come to. And only that's the only way we get a tradition that is vibrant and can actually contribute to a world that needs help.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, each bioregion almost needs to have its own representative, so to speak. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's beautiful to do that. And I think that you do that very, very well, Ben, by the way, creating an open place for dialogue, discussion, ideas, while also maintaining a tradition as far as we can go back. In fact, most people have heard me say, yeah, I mean, technically I would call myself a druid, but I wouldn't call myself that amongst too many folks, because druid means so many things depending on who you're talking to. Some people
It
just think that
does.
you're a nerd
Yeah.
wearing a cape, which, hey, admittedly, if the shoe fits, I'll wear it.
Yeah, exactly.
I've
I
worn
got
many a
nothing
cape.
against capes, that's for sure.
Exactly, yeah. But at the same time, there's so much more
Mhm.
to the tradition. There's so much more to things, and that's what I really have been so gravitated to your work about, and why I've made it such a point to develop a friendship and a point of kinship with you, is because of your inclusivity, and because of your contextualization too of different traditions. It's like, well, I wasn't taught that, but that's an interesting idea. That's a cool thought. Like, just that openness about things is in diabolical contrast to what you see most places in my experience. So you do a
Yeah.
great job of that work. And yeah, for any of our listeners who are interested, Dune More Druid Order is something that I've been following for a long time, and I've been working on lessons with Ben for, it seems like, many years now, 2 or 3
Yeah.
years.
Yep, it has been. Yeah.
And even before that, your initial YouTube videos, I mean, I still go to sleep listening to various stories. Like Ben's voice is always playing every night when I'm going to
That's
bed.
great. I
So
appreciate that. That's really nice to hear. And I think that I think if druids and people who, whether you call yourself a druid or not, let's get past the term. Let's feel the commonality beneath the language. And we get so tripped up in words now, and words have power. That's what the druids taught. But there's an underlying essence behind the words that we really need to connect to. And I think that if we can, whether you consider yourself a druid or an Irish witch or a uh, um, a Celtic pagan, or there's so many terms, there's so many ways to look at it. I really don't give a shit what you call yourself. What I care about is the essence and the profundity you bring to it, and the amount of the how it's, if it lives in your heart, that's what matters. And we get so tripped up and we should say it this way or we should do it this way, that we're missing a big opportunity for there just to be more dialogue, and for there to be more exchange in ideas that we all can just benefit from. So I if you think that I do that, I am, that
hey,
is the
look,
highest
I'm
compliment.
one
I
of the most
appreciate it.
critical people I know, And I can say that you do that better than anybody that I've ever seen, met, or heard ever before. So I think that like what your goal to do and what you're doing are very, very, they're synced up perfectly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Respect.
Gura mahagat. Gura mila mahagat.
Yeah, it's a falta roa to your heart. All right. Well, to all of you who've been watching, I just want to say thank you so much for this. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, share it with friends, put it on your socials, other things like this. These are conversations that I don't think really extend out too frequently into public domain. Oftentimes, people who are interested in academia or scholastics will have conversations like this occasionally, but these are the types of conversations that are available to people of just everyday life and things that are fun for us to think about. And so why not? So if you enjoyed this, please be sure to share it with 1 to 3 people that you think will really enjoy this. Join in the discussion by entering in the comments down below, and we would love to hear from you. If you guys have any other thoughts of dialogues that we can have or other topics that we can go into that you're interested in, please don't hesitate to let us know. You can always reach out to us or put your comments down in the comment box below. And in the meantime, thank you guys so much. And again, Ben, thank you so much for all of your time, brother.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right. All my love to you all. Until our next episode.